So, as someone who works for the St. Louis Food Waste Reduction Group that actively aims to lower food insecurity rates, what does a day in the life look like for you, and what specific actions can society take from your routine specifically to reduce food waste?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I actually work at Missouri Botanical Garden. So I
Mhm.
work on our sustainability team, and so I've done a lot of work, mainly with schools actually looking at waste reduction, which is how I first got into food waste. And so, as part of my job, one of the things I do is work with a food waste reduction working group.
Okay.
So that's like one slice of what I do. And so a lot of what we're really doing is looking at trying to make sure that we're sending less food waste to the landfill. So one part of that strategy is trying to make sure that people who need food are connected with those food resources. And there's a lot of organizations in St. Louis that help to do that. And so we help to work with some of those organizations to try and make sure that they've got that they're sort of connected to why that's important, but also seeing if there's ways that we can help facilitate them getting more food or getting it out to more people.
Okay. So, what specific actions can society take in order to specifically reduce food waste?
Yeah. So when we sort of look at things, looking at our St. Louis plan, one of the things we looked at is where in St. Louis are we throwing away the most food? We might say what sector or what area is that happening in. And so we actually worked with NRDC, which is the National Resource Defense Council, and they helped us model out where food waste is coming from. And so when we looked at that model for St. Louis, most of it comes from residents and restaurants. And so when we think about in St. Louis, how can people reduce food waste? A lot of it is looking at education with residents, so thinking about how we're buying food, but also how we're throwing it away. And then also looking at how restaurants are serving food and what they might be doing with food that ultimately doesn't get eaten. So that's some of the work we've done with like donations is our partners over at Earth Day 365 have a certification program for restaurants called Green Dining Alliance. And they've actually really ramped up helping to connect those restaurants with how they can reduce food waste, either through purchasing less, getting creative with what they make, but also with helping to donate. And so there's a lot of different areas we can work in, but those are sort of the two that we've identified as targets that with the organizations that we work with and where food waste comes from in St. Louis that we can move the needle a little bit more.
Right. Okay. Let's see. How do you measure food waste in St. Louis and your programs, such as what instruments or like mechanics do you use?
Yeah. That's a really tough question and one that we're still trying to figure out, right? So the model we did with NRDC was based on a lot of research that they had done. So what we did basically was give them statistics from the region. So how many grocery stores do we have? How many residents? How many schools? How many hospitals? How many universities? All those kinds of things. And then they took that and based on other cities they've worked with, they came up with what they think we're generating based on all those statistics. Other ways that some organizations within St. Louis have gone about it is by doing something called like a bin dig or at-home audits where they've asked people to actually weigh out food for a certain amount of time that they're throwing away. But that's just a sample. So it's only like one way of doing it. Restaurants have also done some waste audits through Earth Day 365 and Green Dining Alliance, where they've actually charted for a month how much they're throwing away. And so we've gotten some numbers through that, but it's not a holistic picture. The Missouri Department of Natural Resources also does look at how much is getting thrown away, but the last time they did one of those studies was in 2017. I want to say it's the last time one was published. So it's been almost 10 years since the last time that data was collected. So it's not a great number for looking at like how much we're making changes year over year. And then we also work with some of the composting companies to look at how much are they taking in and how much is that changing. But again, that's just one number, and it might have to do with have more people contracted with them. So there's a lot of different metrics we have, but I don't think we currently have like a perfect idea of exactly how much food is being thrown away. We have data points from a lot of different places, but it's an area where I think there's a lot of growth to happen.
Right. So you said you've been using basically like a sample for like representation. Over the years, would you consider or would you say like the statistics have stayed the same? Like has the same amount of food been consistently wasted, or has it been increasing or decreasing?
That's a good question, and it would be hard to say. What I do know one of the big changes that happened from when Missouri Department of Natural Resources did their study in Missouri, so it's across the whole state. One of the big shifts between 2008 when they did their waste profile and 2017 when they did the next one is that previously the highest amount of material that was thrown away in 2008 was paper and cardboard. When we got to 2017, the highest percentage of waste thrown away was organics, so that includes like food as well. Now, does that mean that more food waste was like disposed of, or that we were throwing away less paper and cardboard? Like that's
Yeah.
a harder thing to say. And 2008 is almost 20 years ago at this point, and so like it's hard to compare. We do know that we have a lot more interest in composting, and we have a lot more small scale composting services. So people have far more options if they want to look at composting as an option within their own homes. But I don't have like great numbers to say it's going one direction or the other.
Yeah. Right. So you don't like the organizations don't measure very often. It's like once every like couple of years.
One of the things that we modeled is that we think, based on models in the St. Louis region, we think we throw away about 667,000 tons of food waste
Wow.
every year in the St. Louis region.
That is a
It's
lot.
a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a lot of potential to rescue it before it goes to the landfill. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. So I find that to be particularly eye opening. The other statistic or like metric that we looked at a lot is just how much it costs, right? So, and this was from a study that was done in 2019. So again, think like pre-2020 and how much food prices have gone up. The average consumer in this 2019 study threw away about $1,300 worth of food every year.
Dang, wow, that's a lot.
Like, it's a lot of food that people are throwing away. And so, like, those two pieces together, I think, are really, yeah, they're really
Yeah,
eye-opening. And I think it sort of can really awaken people to the idea of how much we're throwing away. On
yeah,
average, our landfills are about 25, we're throwing away about 25% of the stuff that we're throwing away in landfills is food waste.
wow,
Like it's a huge issue. And it has a lot of downstream effects in terms of like the amount of money we're spending on food that we're throwing away and the amount of people that still need food and how much could be rescued and paired with other organizations, and trying to make sure that we're moving food around in a way that people can have access to it before it goes to the landfill.
yeah. And it also wastes a lot of money, like $1,300. That's not just wasting food. That's a lot of money
For
too.
families.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the US each year, it's about $400 billion,
Wow.
give or take, of food that's thrown away every year. So like it's it's not a small number. And so like this is not a I you know, this is one of those issues where I think it's not it's you're really making a very big difference at like an economic level, an environmental level, and a human level by making some changes in how our food system works to better match the food that we have with people who need. Grassroots organization in St. Louis that's more mutual aid focused is called All Hands on Deck. So they do food shares, free food shares almost every day of the week. A lot of times they're on a regular basis. So it's like the Thursday night food share is always in this place. The Wednesday night food share is always in this place. And the food is given away for free. And it's often donated by restaurants or grocers or other places like that. And then volunteers help to distribute it and make sure it gets out to people. And we've really loved partnering with them. They've been a great organization. We also work with like St. Louis Food Bank and Operation Food Search a lot as well. But then there's other programs where people can get aid so that they can buy food from grocery stores. There's a lot of programs, a lot of groceries in St. Louis that participate with like Double Up Food Bucks, where if you spend a certain amount of money, you might get twice the amount of produce. And so there's a lot of different programs in there. I'm not an expert in all of them. I just know that we work All Hands on Deck, Operation Food Search, and St. Louis Food Bank have been good partners that help to distribute food.
So what are some wasteful everyday habits that like you personally think that if people stop doing, far less food would be wasted, and what are some ways that we can stop these habits?
Yeah, so on a household level, the things that we sort of notice the most is that, most often people are throwing away things like produce and leftovers are kind of the two biggest categories of things that get thrown away. So it's when you're thinking about shopping, especially with produce, making sure that you know how you're going to use it and that you're storing it properly. So not everything gets stored in the fridge. Some stuff is better stored in different parts of the fridge, sort of depending on what it is. And so making sure that you know the correct place to store stuff is really important to making sure it lasts long enough so that you can actually eat it. And then, if you're going to have leftovers, make sure you're eating them. I know not everybody loves them, but like trying to get as creative as you can with eating some of that leftover stuff. And then knowing your expiration dates. They're not real safety dates unless it's infant formula. Those are the only things where dates are actual safety dates. All other food, it's the manufacturer's best guess as to when it's going to be good by. But a lot of times things are good far after their expiration date. Using your senses, your nose, is one of the best ways to know if something is still good to eat.
So you said about the expiration dates and storage. So it's not the problem isn't people like not wanting to eat them or just like changing their minds about it. It's like it going bad, like the produce.
With produce, a lot of times that's it. And I don't have like exact data on this, but I mean, I've talked with a lot of people. I think sometimes people are aspirational shoppers with their produce. Like when you're in the grocery store, you're like, yes, this week I'm eating all fresh foods. I've got a plan. And then by Tuesday, you're like, work is very busy, school's very busy. I'm going to eat out. And then it just sort of
Builds up.
goes to waste. So having a plan and sticking to it and being honest with yourself about who you're going to be during the week in terms of what you eat is one of the best ways I found to match what you're purchasing with what you're actually going to eat.
In the future, do you think technology will grow rapid enough to where we will be able to reduce food waste and its impacts on St. Louis?
From a technology standpoint, there are a lot of people who are looking at this, right? And so this is one of the things that we've been looking at within our St. Louis food ecosystem and haven't quite cracked yet, I would say exactly what the perfect one is, but there's a lot of apps out there that help to match people and like volunteers and food and organizations with each other so that like if someone has extra food, they can post it, somebody can come get it and make sure it gets connected with somebody else. Right now, we don't have one that's actively operating in St. Louis. There is one that started, I want to say a year or two ago, where like a business can opt in to post food and people can purchase it at a very low price. I think it's called too good to go. And so that one started in St. Louis a little while ago, but that's still like purchasing food. So it's kind of like if someone has a bunch of stuff at the end of the night, they might bag it up and you can buy it for like 50% off or something like that. And so trying to figure out how to get some people better match up is a place I think where technology can come into play. I think there's a lot of grocery stores that are already using certain bits of technology to sort of look at how much are they purchasing and then how much are they selling and trying to make sure that it's moving well enough. But I think there's still gaps in ways that can improve a little bit to make sure that people are really using the inventory up and maybe even tracking how long it's been there to make sure that it moves on to its next stage if it's not selling, and some other practices like that. We have some smaller like co-op grocery stores in the region that are a little bit better at that, but they are smaller, so they don't have quite as much inventory that they're moving, so they can be a little bit more nimble with how they put stuff on sale and things like that.
Okay. So beyond food itself, like when you just like throw a meal into the trash can, what other things are being wasted, just other than food?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I just looked at the numbers, so I think it's dropped a little bit, but something like 15% of all of our fresh water use in the United
Wow.
States is used to grow food that nobody ever eats. Not food in general, just the food that nobody ever eats. So there's a lot of water that's wasted there. The other impact we honestly see is really on climate. So when food goes to the landfill, a lot of times when it breaks down, it's going to form a gas called methane. It's also going to form carbon dioxide, but the one in this particular context that we worry about is methane, because methane has a far higher potential to trap heat and is much more impactful on climate change and global warming than carbon dioxide is. Not that carbon dioxide is a big one, but there's been a lot of data in the past few years that methane has far more of an impact than we thought. So that when it does go up into the atmosphere, it's trapping heat, I think, far more effectively than we previously thought. So trying to keep it out of the landfill is like really the big goal. So we want to eat it because there's a lot of energy and resources put into producing food. But if for whatever reason at the end of the day it's not eaten, composting is like the absolute next best option because it keeps it out of the landfill, keeps it from forming all that methane, and then turns it back into a resource that we can use again. And both composting and reducing food waste are huge climate solutions. I would say paired together, if you put them together, often I put them in like the top 3 to 5 of climate solutions, looking at like global impact of what we can do. So there's like a huge potential there to stop producing as quite as much methane from landfills if we don't put food there.
Yeah. So does the food itself cause methane, or is it like the mechanisms in the landfills, or like the
It's a lot of the mechanisms in the landfill. So landfills, their job is to contain trash, toxins, anything that might be coming from trash, and they do a really, really good job at that. But part of the way that that's really effective and safe is that they squish a lot of air and oxygen out of the landfill. Oxygen in a landfill could be a potential fire hazard. It also takes up a lot of space, and they're trying to, put in as much as they can. And the bacteria that operate without oxygen, and so we say anaerobically, are often going to be creating far more methane than like bacteria that are living on a compost pile that are exposed to a lot of oxygen and actually helping to break stuff down. So it has to do with how stuff actually breaks down within the landfill.
or so for us to like as students, since we're trying to spread awareness of food waste, what's like the best thing that you recommend us do to like help spread awareness?
Like in our schools.
Yeah, in our schools.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that schools really have a high potential to do is to look at like what are you doing within your own cafeteria, and so oftentimes that might be thinking about what kind of foods are being offered and what kind of choice do students have to make sure that they're eating as much of the food as they're purchasing in the cafeteria, especially when we look at programs where students might be relying on like free and reduced lunch, which I know is true in many, if not all of the St. Louis public schools, that there's certain things that have to be offered or served as part of those lunches. And so making sure there's enough choice so people can eat those things, but then also having compost available if for whatever reason people don't eat that food. And then some other best practices are making sure kids just have more time for lunch, which I know is a really hard sell in the school sometimes. But getting more time to eat is often a really effective way of making sure that students eat more. And so those are the things that we really see as being high value within schools in terms of shifting what the cafeteria does. We also really like shared tables, which is where if you get food and you don't end up eating it, there's certain items that you can put back that can be shared with other students. So it tends to be like anything that's packaged, any fruit with a peel or rind. So think like an orange, an apple, a banana.
Yeah.
And then oftentimes milk, as long as it goes back in like a cooler or a fridge, are things that can be shared again. And so having those practices set up and people know where they can go to get that food if they need it or where they can put it if they don't want it is another way that people can work on making sure that they're wasting less food in schools.